Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Mondays with Mundy, and that's me, Jim Mundy, the historian for the Union League Legacy Foundation. All right, it's still February of 2023. We started the month off with a program on Abraham Lincoln and President of the United States, and this time we're moving to the governors of Pennsylvania, because I discovered that of the 33 governors of Pennsylvania since the Civil War, 25, it turns out, were Republican, and 10 of those were members of the Union League. So that'd be fun to kind of meet some of those governors. So that's what we're going to do today, starting with the first post-war governor of Pennsylvania, John White Geary. So, having said that, I'm going to share my screen, and we will go deep into the weeds on Governor Geary, because he's really a fascinating character, I think, anyway. Oh, there he is. This is where we wanted to be. All right. So, John White Geary, soldier, governor, and League member. So Geary was born in 1819 in Mount Pleasant in Westmoreland County, which is south of Pittsburgh. All right. He graduated from Jefferson College in 1841 with a degree in civil engineering and in law. But in 1841, railroads basically were gobbling up all the civil engineers. And so he went to work for the Allegheny Portage Railroad, not surprisingly. And that was in 1841. He married in 1843, had two children, the oldest a boy, Edward, and we'll hear about Edward later on in the program, so to speak. And then his wife died in 1853 and then remarried in 1858 and had three more children. So 5 children altogether. So John White Geary, you can see governor of Pennsylvania, 67th century. Okay, Mount Pleasant. Okay, officers first members. Okay, so there was part of the program right there. Okay, so Geary, as a lot of Americans did, he volunteered in the Army for the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. And his military skills were pretty considerable, given that he was a civilian. But he established his own personal habits as a great administrator, as well as a military leader at the same time. And they would vote him well when the Civil War came around in 1861. But in the meantime, as you can see, he held office first in 1849. He was appointed by President James Polk, Democratic, as the first postmaster general of San Francisco. And then in 1850, he was elected on the Democratic ticket as the first mayor of San Francisco. So Geary is a Democrat, and he would stay a Democrat basically until his election as the Republican governor of Pennsylvania in 1866. And that's part of the fun story. All right. He leaves office. He will eventually then, in 1856, be appointed by Democratic President Franklin Pierce as the territorial governor of Kansas. And 1856 was a really tough year to be in Kansas. It was a violent year in Kansas because the struggle was between Kansas being admitted to the Union as a free state or a slave state, otherwise known as Bleeding Kansas, because it was so violent. Being a Democrat, he initially started out on the slave side part of the issue, but as the year went on, he became convinced that it should be a free state. And so in early 1857, the Democrats in Kansas decided to terminate his governorship, or his territorial governorship, and he was actually forced, they fired him basically, and he was forced to leave Kansas in the dead of night carrying 2 pistols because there was an assassination plot out against him. So that is how he ended his career in 1857. He returned to Pennsylvania to his farm, and then 4 years later, the Civil War begins. And at the beginning of the war, Geary raised 2 regiments from Pennsylvania, the 147th, but more importantly, the 28th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment, because it was from Philadelphia. And there were 2 other prominent Philadelphians who become part of the League after the war, much like Geary. So we had John White Geary, we also had Hector Tyndale, and Ariar Pardee. So the Geary proved himself to be a very, very competent colonel who commanded the regiment, the 28th, but in early 1862, with that competency under his belt, he was made a brigadier general. And his brigade was part of the Army of Virginia, where in August of 1862, he was wounded twice at the Battle of Cedar Mountain. And in October, he returns to the Army after recovering, but then he is made a divisional commander. So now a brigade is made up of 4 regiments, and a division is made up of 3 or 4 brigades. So you can see how his command experience grew rather quickly. So And this time, though, he, as a division commander, he's part of the Army of the Potomac, the 12th Corps, commanded by Henry Slocum. And the 12th Corps would be involved, and his division would do very well at the Battle of Chancellorsville in early May of 1863, even though the Union lost the battle. I think arguably through the generalship of its commander, Joseph Hooker. But then just 2 months later, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, was the Battle of Gettysburg. And the 12th was very much involved in that battle. So here we have Geary as he looked in the 1850s when he was both postmaster and governor of San Francisco and then territorial governor of Kansas. This is him in his uniform at the beginning, during the Civil War. He's got the shoulder straps of a brigadier general. All right. And so that's Geary. So at this point now, Gettysburg. Okay. The 12th didn't make it on the field until the end of the day on July the 1st, but they were positioned on the upper right-hand corner where it says Slocum. All right, that's where Geary's division was located, at the top of Culp's Hill, defending Culp's Hill. And luckily, many Union generals were engineers by training, and so they knew how to create fortifications and bastions and things like that on the hill. So it was a very incredibly good defensive position. And actually, at one point in the battle, it was said that there were more Confederates lying deeper on the field and thicker on the field at the bottom of Culp's Hill than any other part of the battlefield. The fighting there was so intense, especially on the night of July the 2nd. The Confederate attack was scheduled for 10 o'clock. It didn't happen until about midnight. But nonetheless, though, Geary's division was incredibly important in helping to save Culp's Hill from the Confederate attack. All right. So the 12th Corps was then transferred to Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is towards the southeast corner of the state, right along the border. And because Eastern Tennessee was fairly Union-oriented, although the Battle of Chattanooga had not gone well under General Rosecrans, and so the 12th was sent there to help shore up the Union Army in that position. And from that position, it was important that the Union Army be supplied because the Confederates had cut off the supply line. And that led to a battle called the Battle of Wauhatchie. And it was in that battle on October 29th of 1863 that Geary's son, Edward, an artillery lieutenant, was killed in the battle and died in his father's arms at that point. And now at that point, the Union Army was outnumbered anywhere from 2-1 to 3-1. But with his, I don't know the adjective, but rage, shall we say, Geary rallied his division and they defeated the Confederates at that point in the Battle of Wauhatchie. And so a rather tragic moment in Geary's life at that point in time. But from that, Geary would go on to command and be part of the Union Army in its march to the sea. So here we have Culp's Hill at Gettysburg, and this is a monument to Edward Geary. Again, you get the idea how big a man he was by looking at that sculpture. Right now, from Chattanooga, obviously the Union Army went on to Atlanta, and this is Geary with his command staff. Geary's in the front row, second from the left. Again, you can see just how big a man he is, or how big a man he was. And of course, from Atlanta, Sherman's March to the Sea, the Carolina campaign. For a moment, he was the military governor of Savannah, Georgia, and he would end the war as a brevet major general. So, very successful military career for John White Geary, which is why when he came back to Philadelphia, he was probably a logical candidate for Republican governor of Pennsylvania. Beautiful portrait of Geary in color. All right. So, as we said, now Geary's a Democrat until about 3 weeks before the election, which made obviously some people very skeptical as to whether he was the right appropriate candidate for governor. But as we've heard earlier, his political leanings were tending more on the abolitionist side, so maybe he actually was the logical candidate after all. And so here we have a broadside saying for governor, Major General John W. Geary. Now, every candidate needs a good song, right? We still have campaign songs, and so there was a General Geary's Grand March that was written for the occasion. Right? And here we have, and if you're wondering what the contest was like, okay, so this is the fall of 1866. The war is over by about a little less than a year and a half. There are two candidates. John White Geary for the Republicans on the right, so to speak, and then Hester Clymer for the Democrats. And if you're wondering if the country had really learned anything from the Civil War, or even now, look at this issue here. So the platforms very clearly stated: Clymer, platform for the white man; Geary's platform for the Negro. And that pretty much summed it up. And there was a radical convention in Philadelphia in the fall. You can see September 3rd of 1866. Every radical candidate for United States Senate took part, white men and women. Are you ready for this? Geary was the candidate and was in the procession supporting his African-American citizens, fellow citizens. The Freedmen's Bureau was created in March of 1865 while the war was still on as a vehicle to help freed slaves adapt to their new freedom and their new position in life. And as you can see, it wasn't well accepted by the Democrats. And at the very bottom, you can see that Geary and Clymer, again, this is a political campaign, again, gubernatorial campaign poster. So once again, Geary is being portrayed as being pro-Black and pro-Freedmen's Bureau. And of course, Clymer, as the Democrats were running, on a white supremacist platform. Now, Geary won the election by approximately 17,000 votes. So he became the second Republican governor of Pennsylvania, but the first post-war governor of Pennsylvania. Right? And that is he. And again, you get the sense of just how big a man he was. Like I said, 6'5", 260 pounds. By now he might be a little heavier, who knows? So as governor, Geary would win, actually when he was a two-term governor, he would repeat his victory, though not by as big a margin. But almost immediately after he was elected governor, which was he began serving in January of 1873. No, I'm sorry, Jim, too many dates running around my head, aren't there? So in 1867, and he would leave office in January of 1873. But of course, in 1870, the country adopted the 15th Amendment, the right to vote for all male citizens. And as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, make no mistake where Geary stands. Not only Geary, but look down, let's read down that list. So you have John White Geary, Negro suffrage. Thaddeus Stevens, obviously one of the great abolitionists in the Civil War period. John W. Forney, member of the Union League, was Secretary of the Senate during the Civil War. Howells Ford, Alexander McClure, another League member. Simon Cameron, who controlled Republican politics in the city, in the state of, actually in the entire state of Pennsylvania. And Geary wasn't a big fan of Cameron's, but he became a Republican despite it, thinking he could work with Cameron, and he did. And then, of course, the Union League sustains the 15th Amendment. And there you go, the Negro, the equal of the poor white man. And you can see that kind of sounds a lot like today's politics, doesn't it? Except we replace poor with college educated. Anyway, on the right-hand side, there are 12 congressmen from Pennsylvania who voted for the 15th Amendment, and 6 of them are Union League members. So you certainly understand where the League stands on this, and certainly Geary. So interesting there. I thought it'd be good to see this. All right. So much like today, the big issue during Geary's 2 administrations was voter protection, because this was an age of corruption where it was not unusual or unheard of, and actually was kind of expected, that one could vote early and often. And so one of the first things that took place in Geary's administration was the creation of something called the Registry Act of 1869. And this really tightened up election procedures, voting procedures, voter registration, who could vote, how, all that kind of stuff. So no longer were people in theory voting early and often, although there were still a number of loopholes in it. And by the way, this Registry Act was completely endorsed by the Union League and its leading members at the same time, because the League was at this point a very good government organization, if you will. But there were still loopholes in it. And so it didn't necessarily achieve all the things that it had hoped to, because there was still the corruption. People were still padding registration rolls and things like that. But that would lead then to a demand for a new constitution. Now, the Voter Registration Act hadn't really changed since 1834, and the Pennsylvania State Constitution since 1838. Up until then, Black men could vote in Pennsylvania, but they lost that privilege in the 1838 Constitutional Convention. So that would become one of the cornerstones of the new state constitutional convention at the League's urging. And I cannot stress that enough. The League was incredibly pro new constitution for the state of Pennsylvania. The convention itself took place between November of 72 and December of 73 when the vote took place in the state of Pennsylvania, and it was accepted and approved by the citizens of Pennsylvania. It took place on January the 1st of 1874. So here you can see this address by John White Geary to the General Assembly supporting this new state constitution. And it was at that point one of the greatest political achievements of any Pennsylvania governor. So John White Geary certainly left his mark on the state of Pennsylvania when he was governor. So he left governor, as I said earlier, in January of 1873. He was out of office no more than 3 weeks when he was feeding one of his young sons when he had a heart attack and died at the age of 53. And thus ended the career of John White Geary. So here we have Geary's cemetery plot in the Harrisburg Cemetery. And again, another sculpture of John White Geary. And then we have Geary at the League itself. So this is the Lincoln Memorial Room. And if you're looking at the west wall that has the Lincoln sculpture in the central niche, look to the far left on the wall. And that's what you see here on the left-hand side panel. And on the right-hand side, and then again, these panels, these 8 bronze tablets, contain the 532 names of League members who were members of the League up to 1917. So Civil War veterans, Union League members, 1917. And there we have at the top list of governors in Pennsylvania, John White Geary. So, all right. I think that worked. All right. So on that, I hope we've all learned a little something more about John White Geary, and I hope it prompts all of you to go out and learn more about him yourselves, because he was a fascinating character. It's a shame that he died so young. I think he would have had a lot more to do with both Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and the Union League. So that wraps up today's episode. Thank you for watching. I hope it was interesting. I hope you all stayed awake. Okay, so we'll see you in 2 weeks. So in those 2 weeks, everybody stay well, stay healthy, stay happy, and thanks for watching. We appreciate your support. So goodbye now.